The room did not erupt and no one shouted as the decision was finalized, but inside one of the palace's most guarded chambers, a quiet earthquake changed the balance of royal power in a single breath. Prince Edward, who had spent decades remaining almost invisible beside louder names, was suddenly handed the profound role Camilla believed was well within her reach. Prince William's absolute refusal turned a private council consultation into an institutional shifting point that will echo through the monarchy for generations to come. Edward sat perfectly still at the far end of the polished mahogany table with his hands folded and his face controlled, hiding his shock behind a lifetime of royal discipline. Camilla did not look at him because her gaze was locked entirely on William, since everyone in that chamber understood that the Prince of Wales had not merely objected to her rise, but he had completely blocked her path. The Privy Council, which serves as the senior advisory body supporting the monarch on important state and constitutional matters, had suddenly become the precise place where an unresolved family wound was turned into a cold institutional decision. Buckingham Palace held its breath, not because the decision was announced with loud fanfare, but because everyone knew it was final and irreversible. William had arrived at the meeting completely prepared, since the future king had not walked into that consultation with a passing concern or a son's frustration, but he carried a heavily detailed written argument clear enough to leave no space for compromise. Every single line of his argument pointed toward the exact same conclusion: that Camilla could not inherit the late queen's old symbolic place in council life. That role had never been an ordinary title, but it was a quiet moral presence and a steadying influence that people trusted because the late monarch never appeared to want power for herself. After her death, that significant space had remained completely empty, and its emptiness mattered because whoever filled it would be seen as carrying her absolute restraint. Camilla lowered her eyes when Edward's name was spoken, and though the queen consort did not protest, the small change in her face said what words would have exposed that she had expected resistance, but not complete replacement. Edward felt the weight of that heavy moment settle on him like a burden he had never reached for or desired, yet he did not smile, and he did not lean forward, but remained completely still, which made William's case even stronger. King Charles said absolutely nothing during the exchange, and the king's heavy silence spread across the chamber, like a second verdict, which was heavier because everyone knew what it cost him. To defend Camilla would mean directly confronting William, but to accept Edward would mean admitting that the palace trusted quiet duty more than visible desire. As the closed doors kept the chaotic world outside, one question pressed against every face in the room as to why William had chosen this exact moment to stop Camilla. Every royal crisis has a hidden room where the official story ends and the human story begins, and this particular crisis had four faces that mattered most. William was carrying the undeniable force of the future, while Camilla was fighting for final institutional recognition. Charles remained trapped between personal loyalty and his duty to the monarchy, while Edward was the quiet brother suddenly asked to carry the massive shadow of the queen. None of them entered that room unchanged, and none would leave untouched, because William understood that the decision before them was not about pride or ceremony. To him, the Privy Council role was not a mere decoration, but it was the monarch's senior circle of advisors, where ancient authority still brushed against modern government, and where the queen's presence had always meant total restraint. She had made power feel incredibly steady, and she had made silence feel entirely safe, so when Camilla's name moved toward that vacant space, the prince saw more than simple ambition. He saw a direct test of memory, trust, and the future safety of the crown itself. Edward carried a completely different weight because he had spent years outside the brightest media lights, never forcing himself into the center of attention. That was precisely why his name landed with such immense force, because he had not asked for the queen's shadow, nor had he built a campaign around it. His natural calm had become his ultimate proof, and his discretion had become his shield, which Camilla knew and Charles knew and William trusted deeply. Camilla watched William fold his hands before speaking, and that small deliberate movement told her he had already decided her fate. She kept her face perfectly composed, but the stillness around her looked deeply wounded rather than calm. The queen consort had survived years of public judgment, suspicion, and proving that she could stand beside Charles without breaking under the noise. She truly believed that her years of service had earned her access to the crown's deepest machinery, but William was not measuring years because he was measuring trust. Charles felt the room closing around him because the king wanted Camilla protected, as her rejection would feel like his own failure to defend her. Yet he also knew William's objection carried more than family tension because it carried immense constitutional weight, public instinct, and the cold truth that the monarchy could not afford another battle over legitimacy. Charles looked toward Edward, then back toward Camilla, and in that brief glance set the pain of a monarch who could not rescue everyone. Edward remained quiet, and his quietness hurt her most, because if he had fought for the role, Camilla could have easily called it rivalry. If he had spoken proudly, she could have called it personal ambition, but he did neither, so his selection looked like pure institutional trust, which made the wound sharper. This buried moment, which was once dismissed as a simple misunderstanding, would become the ultimate trigger that made William draw a line Camilla could never cross. The crisis did not begin with a council vote, but it began weeks earlier beneath polished chandeliers and controlled smiles during a private memorial ceremony for the late Queen. What seemed like a minor breach of protocol became in William's eyes something far more dangerous, because he saw one gesture, one whispered exchange, and one attempt to step into the Queen's old place. The future king decided right then that the line had been crossed because William had arrived at Windsor carrying grief, duty, and a silence that felt heavier than ceremony. The memorial service was entirely private, away from public cameras and official cheers, which made every gesture feel more honest and every mistake more exposed. Senior royals had gathered to honor the Queen's legacy, but this was not only about remembrance, because private royal ceremonies are where family trust is tested without the shield of public applause. It mattered immensely because the Queen's personal authority had always rested on absolute restraint and not on public performance. Camilla knew the service carried emotional weight, and the Queen consort had spent years trying to prove she could stand inside the royal family without looking like an intruder. That day offered her a perfect chance to appear steady, accepted, and central to the family's future. But when she moved to lead the private closing reflection, the mood in the chapel changed instantly. The closing reflection was a final spoken tribute at the end of the ceremony, which was a moment traditionally linked to the late monarch's personal place within the family circle. Camilla stepped toward it without William's prior approval, and the prince saw more than confidence, because he saw a direct claim to authority. Edward sensed the discomfort before anyone else could name it, and he paused just long enough to show he understood the danger before following with careful restraint. He would not embarrass Camilla in front of the family, but that quiet pause mattered because it told William he was not imagining the shift. It told Charles the room had felt the breach, and it told Edward that silence once again might be the only thing preventing a private tribute from turning into open confrontation. William watched from across the chapel, with his jaw tightening as the moment unfolded before his eyes. The future king did not interrupt, and he did not correct her, but something deep inside him hardened. After the service ended, he pulled a senior courtier aside and asked one direct question: whether Camilla had been advised to take that place. The answer did not come as a speech, but it came as a note from the ceremony plan showing that her office had requested a larger role than the family had first agreed upon. Charles later tried to treat the moment as a simple misunderstanding, but William could not forget it because Camilla had not simply stepped forward, but she had stepped into a space still filled by the Queen's memory. From that day, the prince began preparing to block any formal attempt to place her near that same influence again, and by the time Camilla's bid reached the palace table, William was no longer reacting to a rumor, because he was responding to a moment he had seen with his own eyes. The true confrontation came entirely without raised voices, which in the quiet world of the palace made it even more devastating for everyone involved. William did not accuse Camilla in front of the public, nor did he make a dramatic scene during the official gathering, but he waited patiently until the heavy doors closed. He waited until every single aide and courtier was dismissed from the room, until the chamber contained only those who fully understood the immense cost of each spoken word. Then he looked directly toward Charles, deliberately avoided Camilla's anxious eyes, and said the exact sentence that ended her ambitious bid before it could even breathe. William chose his words with the absolute control of a man who knew that one wrong phrase could split the family room forever. Charles sat close enough to feel the emotional pressure before it even arrived, and Camilla watched the young prince, as if she already sensed the heavy blow forming in his mind. Edward remained completely apart from the immediate tension, not because he was untouched by the gravity of the situation, but because he deeply understood that his own silence had become dangerous. This intense meeting had been strategically arranged even before the formal Privy Council consultation began, which was the senior advisory process, where the monarch traditionally receives guidance on major state affairs. That specific timing mattered immensely because Camilla's closest supporters had fully expected Charles to approve her place quietly before any real objection could gather force. Camilla believed the path to the council had been perfectly prepared for her because the queen consort had endured years of public suspicion and years of proving herself beside the king. Now she saw the late queen's symbolic advisory presence as a final, undeniable sign of her institutional acceptance within the crown. It was not a physical crown she was reaching for, but it was something much quieter and therefore far more intimate to the machinery of the monarchy. It meant being trusted near the deepest secrets of state, and it meant the family had finally stopped measuring her turbulent past and started accepting her future. But William saw that exact same role through a much colder and more protective lens because to him, anything linked to the late queen's private constitutional judgment required restraint. He believed it required a discipline that went far beyond personal loyalty, beyond marriage, and beyond ordinary royal rank. William finally spoke clearly and said he could not support Camilla inheriting any role associated with the Queen's old authority, and those words landed cleanly like ice. Camilla pushed her heavy chair back slightly, not enough to leave the room, and not enough to appear completely broken, but enough for the harsh sound to cut through the silence. Charles turned toward his son with deep pain held tightly behind his controlled expression because the king knew this was no longer only about her, but it was about his own judgment too. Charles then asked the one question everyone in the room feared to hear, whether this fierce objection was purely personal or if it was constitutional. William held the heavy pause just long enough for the air in the room to tighten, then answered with absolute finality that it was both. That single word changed everything in an instant because Camilla had been denied things before, but never with such calm and devastating finality. The prince did not rage, and he did not plead with his father, but he calmly named Edward as the only person in the family whose discretion matched the late queen's perfect example. Edward looked completely stunned by the sudden nomination because he had not reached for the moment, and that exact restraint became his strongest claim to the role. Charles saw it clearly, and Camilla felt it deeply, while William trusted it completely, because in a room built entirely on power, the quietest man had become the ultimate proof. But William's firm refusal only mattered because behind his words stood a much deeper institutional power, one rooted not in emotion but in the total control of the monarchy's future machinery. Power in the palace does not always arrive with a golden crown on its head, because sometimes it comes through perfect timing, inheritance, public trust, and the quiet recognition that one generation is beginning to yield to the next. William did not need to shout or demand authority, because everyone in that guarded chamber understood exactly what his objection represented to the crown. He was not merely a son disagreeing with his father's wishes, but he was the living future of the entire institution, refusing to bend to personal desires. William carried a unique power that could never be written neatly on official paper, because the prince was the direct heir and the next face of the monarchy. That structural reality made his objection much more than simple family resistance, because the public already looked to him as the steady bridge between the late queen's discipline and the crown's uncertain future. It mattered because any role tied to her sacred memory would not only shape private palace decisions, but also send a massive message to the world about who the family trusted with its most guarded moral authority. Camilla wanted final recognition while William wanted total protection, and between those two intense desires the monarchy began to split down the middle. Charles read the final advisory recommendation, once then read it again slowly, as if the harsh meaning might somehow soften the second time. It did not soften, and the king placed the white page flat on the polished table while the silence around him became almost unbearable to endure. The document praised Edward's lifelong restraint, loyalty, and his complete lack of personal ambition in traditional palace language that was never casual. In the world of courtiers, that praise was a definitive verdict because the council recommendation was the formal paper guiding the final decision. In simple terms, it told the monarchy exactly who is safest to trust near sensitive constitutional conversations, and Edward's name was there because he had never appeared hungry for the place. Charles felt completely exposed by every single line of that paper because to support Camilla openly would now mean challenging William openly in front of the courtiers. The king understood the immense danger of that battle because if he defended his wife too strongly, he risked making the family look deeply divided over the late queen's legacy. If he stayed completely silent, he allowed Edward to become the only logical answer where Camilla had expected total acceptance. That was the absolute cruelty of the moment for Charles because he could protect his beloved wife or he could protect the crown's calm surface, but he could not fully do both. Edward did not celebrate the high recommendation because he seemed almost burdened by the sudden weight of it, and that genuine reaction made his selection even harder for anyone to attack. Palace advisors had reached the exact conclusion William wanted them to see from the beginning because Edward's quiet temperament made him the safer guardian of the Queen's legacy. He had no visible media campaign, no circle of friends pushing his claim, and no emotional demand placed before the family room. His ultimate strength was his absolute absence of hunger for power, while Camilla understood the deep wound before anyone even explained it to her. The palace had not simply denied her a prestigious role, but it had officially chosen another royal as her moral replacement in the family hierarchy. Once Edward's name was formally written where Camilla had fully expected her own to be, the fallout began moving through the palace corridors faster than anyone could contain. The immediate consequence of the council's dramatic decision was not a loud public statement, but it was a cold, solitary walk through the palace corridors. Camilla left the historic chamber with 2 loyal aides following quietly behind her, but absolutely no one from the family stood beside her as she walked away. The grand corridor outside seemed significantly longer than usual, lined with towering portraits of ancient monarchs who had survived massive storms of blood, marriage, betrayal, and institutional duty. She did not cry or show emotional weakness in front of those painted eyes, but she did something much colder because she stopped, turned once toward the closed wooden door, and kept walking into the shadows. Camilla knew with absolute certainty that the definitive decision had already escaped the room, even if no official public word had been spoken to the press. Palace aides moved quickly through the secondary rooms, not with chaotic panic, but with that controlled urgency that always meant power had shifted permanently. Internal council briefings were being adjusted immediately, and Edward's name was being systematically placed where the late Queen's old symbolic presence had once stood for decades. Those sensitive briefings mattered immensely because they directly shaped who received confidential advice, who entered the private circle first, and who was trusted near the monarchy's most protected constitutional conversations. For Camilla, the sudden change was utterly devastating because her personal team had fully prepared for a quiet approval and not a sharp rejection that elevated another royal above her rank. Charles understood the massive emotional damage before anyone even explained it to him, and the king later found Camilla waiting in a private sitting room, seated completely alone. Her elegant gloves were still held tightly in her hand, as if she had physically walked out of the chamber but had not fully left the heavy moment behind her. She looked publicly secure to the outside world, still crowned, still highly protected by her official rank, and still standing beside the king in the eyes of the public. But privately within the palace walls, she seemed fundamentally diminished because the family had drawn a protective circle around the late Queen's memory, and somehow she had been left just outside it. Charles wanted desperately to comfort his wife, but no words of comfort could undo what the official council decision had just declared to the institution. Camilla did not need her husband to explain the complex palace language because she knew exactly what it meant when aides stopped asking her office for daily guidance. She knew what it meant when Edward received a sealed briefing folder from the couriers before any official explanation was even drafted for the rest of the family. A sealed briefing folder was a highly confidential file given only to someone officially cleared for private constitutional discussions, and its arrival proved the transfer of influence was already moving. Edward had not won this significant position with loud noise or political campaigns, but he had advanced entirely through long-term institutional trust. William made sure the entire change stayed understated, because the young prince requested that the transition remain completely calm, quiet, and almost invisible to the media. He did not want Edward's rise to look like an aggressive victory over Camilla, since open triumph would have deepened the family wound and turned a private settlement into a public war. Yet that absolute silence carried its own unique cruelty, because the less the palace said to the public, the more obvious the internal truth became to everyone. Edward accepted the sealed folder with a physical heaviness he could not hide, because silence had protected him for years, but now it had placed him at the center of a royal fracture. Yet Edward could not carry the late queen's massive shadow without first facing the brother whose sudden silence hurt him most. For the first time since the final decision, there were no royal advisors, no official papers, and no formal language to hide behind. Charles and Edward stood completely alone in a private room where the late queen's personal presence still seemed to live within the historic furniture, the silence, and the careful distance between them. One brother had lost total control of the institutional outcome, while the other had gained a profound role he never sought, and neither knew whether to apologize. Charles asked Edward to stay behind after the final council papers had been distributed, and that simple request carried more weight than any official command. The king had spent his entire life learning how to survive the harsh demands of royal duty, but this specific wound was different. This wound had not come from the aggressive press, the judging public, or an enemy outside the palace walls, but it had come from inside the family. It had come from the future king, from a definitive decision that placed Edward near the queen's old influence while leaving Camilla completely outside it. That mattered immensely, because the modern monarchy depends not only on written rules, but on the fundamental belief that its closest figures trust one another completely when the heavy doors close. Edward waited patiently for his brother to speak first, because he had always known the exact shape of royal silence, since he had lived inside it for decades. While Charles carried the heavy burden of kingship, Edward served faithfully in much quieter corners, rarely demanding public attention, and rarely using disappointment as a weapon. That was precisely why the final decision felt so painful, because his reward came not through personal ambition but through absolute restraint, and somehow that restraint had now become a sharp knife between two brothers. Charles did not say Camilla's name at first, because he did not need to, since the king's face carried the heavy confession he could not form into a clear sentence. Her public rejection felt like a direct rejection of his own personal judgment as a monarch. If the palace could not trust his wife with the queen's symbolic role, then what did that say about his own choice to protect her, defend her, and place her beside him on the throne? Edward heard the unspoken question and answered with deep humility instead of pride, telling Charles he had not asked for the role, and if the monarch commanded it, he would step back immediately. Charles moved away toward the window before replying, and he paused long enough for Edward to understand that the generous offer had hurt him just as much as it helped. Stepping back would not heal the wound, the king finally said, because it would only make the fracture look much deeper to the public. Edward's appointment had become the one single outcome the monarchy could survive without appearing openly divided to the world. Camilla would suffer the private pain, William would stand firm in his position, and Charles would carry the internal ache, but the crown would remain steady. Edward accepted that hard truth with quiet pain, because he had inherited the queen's shadow but not her peace. And when news of his silent rise began moving beyond palace walls, the family learned that silence could hide a decision, but it could not control what people believed it meant. Outside the palace walls, one striking image on a newspaper front page turned a private decision into a definitive national judgment by morning. The country had its symbol, not a leaked transcript or a full explanation, but just one front page that captured everything the palace had tried to keep quiet. It showed Edward walking alone through a side entrance, Camilla seated in the rear of a dark car, her face turned away, and William standing upright near the palace steps. In those three distinct images, the public saw defeat, restraint, and absolute power. Edward saw the newspaper before anyone had warned him how sharply the story had landed, and the headline was impossible to soften. Edward steps into the Queen's shadow. It ran across a major London front page beside the three raw images that turned a private decision into a public judgment. That mattered because the palace had tried to control the announcement through silence, yet silence had allowed others to define the meaning first. It mattered because ordinary people did not need complex council language to understand humiliation, since they only needed to see who looked chosen, who looked rejected, and who looked in complete command. Edward set down his cup and stared at the page with quiet discomfort, because he had accepted the role as a duty and not a prize, but now the country was reading his restraint as a victory over Camilla. The morning broadcasters sharpened the moment further, calling it the quietest royal transfer of influence in a generation. Those words carried immense force because transfer meant something substantial had moved, and influence meant someone powerful had lost it. Edward understood at once that his silence could no longer protect him from becoming the public face of another person's deep pain. Camilla refused to comment, and that total refusal became its own kind of powerful statement, because the queen consort had survived public storms before, but this one cut differently. It touched the inner life of the monarchy, and not just its public image. An aide noticed her asking for the morning papers to be removed from the room, and the small request said more than anger ever could. She did not want to see Edward framed as duty while she was framed as total defeat, nor did she want William praised for restraint while her own years of service were reduced to simple ambition. Crowds began gathering outside Buckingham Palace, not in rage, but in restless curiosity, reading the headline aloud as if decoding a family secret written in plain words. Some spoke Edward's name with genuine surprise, others spoke Camilla's with deep pity, and by midday public sympathy had shifted in a way the palace had not expected. Edward looked honorable because he had not demanded anything. Camilla looked wounded because she had wanted something too visible to ignore, and William looked vindicated because the reaction proved his deepest fear. The monarchy could survive pain, but it could not survive confusion over trust, so when the noise finally settled, the ultimate verdict was not written by courtiers or headlines, but by the emotional truth each royal was forced to accept. In the end, the palace did not need another official announcement, because the verdict had already been delivered in absolute silence. Edward had inherited the queen's role because he never reached for it. Camilla had lost it because too many believed she wanted it too visibly. Charles had been wounded because love and monarchy had collided, and William had shown that the future king would protect the crown even from those inside his own family. Edward accepted the role without a single ounce of triumph, and that was why the decision carried such immense force. He understood that service was not a victory, and the queen's role was never meant to look like a prize because it was a heavy burden shaped entirely by discipline, memory, and trust. Stepping into that shadow meant carrying her restraint and not replacing her presence. Camilla felt the limit with painful clarity because the queen consort was not exiled or stripped of rank, but something more intimate had been denied to her. The institution had drawn a clear boundary around its most trusted inner circle, and she had been shown exactly where that boundary stood. Royal power is not only measured by titles, but it is measured by access, confidence, and who is allowed near the conversations that shape the crown's future. Camilla still had her high position, but Edward had been given the ultimate trust. Charles signed the final acknowledgement with a hand that seemed heavier than the paper itself, confirming the palace decision and allowing the transition to stand. After the others left, the king remained seated, staring at the empty chair beside him, feeling the true cost of a choice he had not fully controlled. He had protected the monarchy's calm surface, but he had failed to protect Camilla from the wound beneath it. William walked away with no celebration in his step because the prince knew he had guarded the queen's legacy, yet he also knew he had deepened a family fracture that might never fully heal. He had chosen restraint over comfort, duty over softness, and continuity over peace. At the dinner table, the future king had won the long argument, but victory inside a family can still feel like a devastating loss. Edward became the living bridge between the queen's old discipline and a reign still searching for its shape. Camilla carried the pain of being stopped, Charles carried the ache of being divided, and William carried the heavy burden of being right. This historic moment proved that in the royal family, the greatest power does not always belong to the loudest claimant, because sometimes it belongs to the person trusted to say nothing and carry everything. This was not merely Edward's quiet rise or Camilla's painful rejection, but it was the monarchy reminding itself that trust once questioned can never be demanded because it must be earned in absolute silence.